Hi all, welcome. Wonderful to see many of you here tonight. I am speaking to you tonight from the unceded lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people, along with our other First Nations people, and having abided European invasion. They have lived continuously on these lands for many thousands of years. I pay my respects to those who live on country as carers and custodians. And I extend that respect to any First Nations person who may be here this evening. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Monique Rooney. I teach and research in the English program here at the ANU in Canberra. And I'm the co-director, along with Kath Bode, of the newly established Centre for Australian Literary Cultures, also known as CALC. So just a few words about CALC before we get started with this evening's event. CALC is an ANU research centre focused on raising the visibility of Australian literature, both at home and abroad. Taking an interdisciplinary approach, CALC aims to continue ANU's founding position in understanding and promoting Australian literature. And in doing so, we hope to better connect local and national scholars with international scholars. And we have that very opportunity tonight with Merve Emre. The event tonight is part of CALC's 2022 seminar series. If you'd like to be on the email list for this series, please do get in contact with me. Again, that's Monique Rooney, and you can contact me by email, and I'm also on Twitter. It's with great pleasure that I now introduce Joseph Steinberg, who will introduce Merve. And it was Joseph's terrific idea to hold this conversation about Gerald Murnane. Joseph is a student at the University of Cambridge, where he is currently completing his dissertation, which is titled The Program Goes South, Australian Prose and the University, 1970 to 2020. And Gerald Murnane is one of the authors Joseph is covering in what is shaping up to be a brilliant dissertation. So he's in the perfect position to talk with Merve this evening. Over to you, Joseph.
Great. Thanks so much, Monique. That was a really lovely and generous introduction. Before I introduce Merve, let me just remind everyone that the session will be recorded. This fact doesn't particularly matter, except for those of you that might be keen to pose questions at the end. Just keep in mind that whatever you ask can and will be preserved for posterity. And of course, if you do actually pose a sufficiently inflammatory question, you might even end up with your name on a folder in Murnane's archive. So do be careful, please. On to the introduction. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Merve Emre, an associate professor of English at the University of Oxford and contributing writer at the New Yorker. She's the author of Paraliterary, and I've got my copy right here. And she's also the author of The Ferrante Letters and The Personality Brokers, which was also published under the title What's Your Type? It was selected as one of the best books of 2018 by the New York Times, The Economist, NPR, CBC, and The Spectator, and it informs the CNN HBO Max documentary feature film Persona. She's also the editor of Once and Future Feminist and the annotated Mrs. Dalloway, and she's currently finishing a book titled Post-Discipline, Literature, Professionalism, and the Crisis of the Humanities, and also writing another with the title Love and Other Useless Pursuits. I could say much more. I have a much long list.
Well, you're just reminding me how much work I have to do. So I think we should stop the introduction now before I feel extremely stressed out.
Well, in that case, I will skip the many other reviews and articles
we can see that.
and all the numerous prizes. But I will just say in closing that on top of doing all of this amazing stuff, she's also found time this year to be a judge of the Booker Prize. And I think it speaks very highly of her character that despite doing all of this, she's still made time to have conversation with a junior academic like myself. So thank you very much, Merve. It's such a pleasure.
Well, I have such fond memories of meeting you in Cambridge and then having coffee with you here and talking about reading practices and about Nabokov. And thank you for inviting me, because I really do feel like an interloper in a particular national literary scene and national literary tradition. And I did just want to maybe start before we get to the game we're going to play that you've set up for us, that I hope everyone is as excited for as I am, by just giving a kind of shout out to the wonderful collection edited by Anthony Ullman that I have been reading through over the past couple of months, and all of the brilliant scholars of Australian literature in that collection. So thank you for having me, and please, apologies in advance for my amateurism relative to those of you who are experts.
Hardly at all. But totally agreed in terms of the shout out to that collection. It's a really excellent one. Actually, we had a little review of it in JSOL, which was hopefully, gave it the proper appreciation that it well deserves. As Merve's mentioned, I thought it would be quite fun to start off today's session with a little game. I mean, it makes perfect sense when sitting down with the author of a book called What's Your Type, to start off by playing a little game of types. I've come up with this game, which I call the Gerald Murnane type indicator, which is based off the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is the subject of Merve's book. And I've already told Merve the rules, but I'll run through them again just so that our audience can play along at home if they so desire. So to participate in this little game, what you need to do is you need to follow the link in the blurb on the registration page, which will take you to an article titled The Three Archives of Gerald Murnane. And what I'll do actually is I'll share my screen and I'll pull it up just so that you can see what I'm talking about. Here we go. Great. So you can see my very messy desktop there. And now hopefully you should be able to see the piece that I'm referring to. So this is Murnane's Chronological Archive. You'll see here that he has this long list of sort of, signposts that he's actually attached to particular files. And these signposts are sort of interesting acts of self-positioning and performance. And the way this game works is really simple. All I've asked Merve to do is to pick out the three signposts that she feels best represent the sort of mysterious, authorial personage that is Gerald Murnane to her. And I've also picked out three. And the idea is that we'll sort of compare our choices and think about what Murnane means to each of us. So we have two options. We could either I can go first or you can go first, or indeed the third option is that we can sort of reveal a choice each one at a time. How would you like to proceed, Merve?
I think we should alternate. So you name one and then I will name one. And I'm having that experience where now that I'm seeing the list again, I'm inclined to change my original choices. But you go ahead, Joseph. And can I just actually say one thing before you start? I had a distinct feeling of cognitive dissonance as I was doing this exercise, because all of these signposts or all of these little titles seem to me extraordinarily aggressive in a way that I do not find Murnane's prose. And so that was actually quite an interesting experience of going through and feeling as if there was a kind of tonal shift that was happening in the labeling of the archival folders, and what the distance might be between the prose and the tonal shift of these labels. So I'm interested to see whether you felt the same way and whether your choices map that feeling that I'm describing.
Yeah, well, I think there's a great deal of truth to that. I mean, I think one of the things that I would claim about this list is that it is an interesting counterpoint to the fiction, in that both are aspiring to a kind of truth status. I mean, Murnane famously calls his sort of reports works of true fiction, and we'll come to that a little bit later on. But here I think truth is something closer to a kind of, gossipy, kind of verging on rumor mongering, kind of discussion. A little bit of backstabbing even that sort of circulates around.
And a kind of high and presumably unfiltered affectivity. Like I thought for a moment that I might just choose all of the ones with exclamation marks. Hoaxes, how I love them. I give up writing fiction again. And the appearance of these little M dashes of the exclamation marks, of the question marks, actually seemed to me quite striking when compared to the kind of vast grammatical apparatus of the rest of his prose. But I'm talking about like the rules of the game rather than playing the game. So I think we should actually play the game, and you should start.
True. Well, how about I start by breaking the rules of the game slightly, and I'll tell you my runners-up, because I do have 2 runners-up. The first runner-up is I taught apprentice jockeys for 30 years, which I think is on the 2nd page. Let me see if I can find it. Actually, maybe it's not. Fallout. Here it is, this item. So just after a letter of 8,000 words, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I taught apprentice jockeys for 30 years. It's there on the first page. I mean, I picked this, well, I didn't pick this item. This item is a runner-up, in part because I was just thinking about your book Paraliterary and the way in which, if you were to sort of write a crazed Antipodean sequel to that book, thinking about Murnane in relation to this like annual general education honorary lecturer position that he held at this jockey school would be the perfect sort of zany note on which to begin that book. So that's my number 1 kind of runner-up. Number 2 would just be the kind of strikingly quotidian A Day in the Life of Gerald Murnane. And that seems to me a really odd and interesting one, despite its kind of banality, precisely because we never at any point, despite the sort of intensely autoexegetical nature of his fiction, we don't really get a typical day in the life of Gerald Murnane anywhere in the fiction. It's all inner life. So that struck me as another kind of interesting runner-up / counterpoint. I'll stop breaking the rules now and tell you my actual first one. It's the first one in the list. It's I Fall Out with Barry Oakley. Well, I'm sort of thinking about like trends. I was quite tempted just to pick 3 that mention other writers, because that's what really interests me about this, the sort of sheer name dropping that goes on the list. But I went with this one, in part because it has a sequel later on in the list. He later says, Oakley and I go at it again. But the primary reason that I picked it is because it's just such a fascinating starting point for the discussion. I mean, this first fallout with Barry Oakley happened because they had, let's say, differing opinions of Murnane's novel Inland. Barry Oakley wasn't a huge fan. But the second fallout actually happened over this list, in that Murnane had sent around this sort of list of his archive's contents to several libraries, as well as, it seems, to a few close friends. And I know this because Oakley writes about it in his memoir, which is called Mugshots. And I'll just read you what he had to say about this list. In his accompanying letter, Gerald said he'd welcome any comments. So I told him the material was both extraordinary and somewhat disturbing. To me, the archives revealed, I summarize, a solipsistic belief that the self is the only reality, a self so documented that there's a sense of seeing himself endlessly repeated in mirror after mirror. Gerald was outraged. The other recipients, librarians, had nothing but praise. With Gerald, if you weren't an admirer, you were an enemy, and now I was one. So that first item, when you realize that sort of history, that rocky history to their relationship, it might start to look a little bit like a warning. Now, I wouldn't describe myself as an enemy of Gerald Murnane, far from it. I'm actually much more the camp of admirer, but I'm not just an admirer either. You know, I have some reservations about some of his work. So I thought just drawing that out of that first item on that list might be a useful springboard for our discussion. So what's item number 1 for you? Sorry.
Well, but I want to stick with yours. I mean, do you think that is a good reading of the list? Because you know, to my mind, at least, this is an intensely funny list. And I think one of the things it does show us is that Murnane is an incredibly humorous writer in the prose as well. And I think that can sometimes get overlooked when the emphasis falls on the solipsism, on the idealism, right, on the radical idealism. But this to me is intensely funny. And there's something about the repeated insistence on the proper names of other people. And I know we're going to talk about this later, right? Naming, and in particular, the proper name, is such an intense site of fixation in the prose. But here it's presented so unabashedly and without any of the qualifications that we get in the prose, that there's something really, really funny about that when you read naming in the list alongside the prose. So I'm curious if you think that that's a fair reading, if Oakley's reading of the list as disturbing is fair.
Yeah, well, I think that you're absolutely right in that it's actually not. It's actually a wildly unfair reading. I think actually it's not solipsistic. It's actually a highly sociable list. It's a kind of bad sociality, and it's often kind of argumentative and combative, and it's feuds and spats and, bouts of anger. But it actually reminds us, that Murnane is not a kind of purely provincial writer, sort of sequestered away in Goricky, kind of working purely by himself. He is interestingly connected with other figures, particularly some other figures in the Australian literary landscape. And I think in that sense, it's actually an interesting reminder of precisely that as well, of Oakley's reading as a misreading that sort of really underestimates the degree of connectivity that Murnane enjoys.
Well, I mean, I like what you just said about it being a bad kind of sociality, because my choice was actually came close at the end of the list. And it is, should I tell literature, capital L, should I tell literature to get fucked? Question mark. And I love this for a couple of reasons. I mean, first, I like that it does actually seem to be in earnest a question, as opposed to a foregone conclusion. Should I, in fact, tell literature to get fucked? But it raises as many questions as it seems to, as it asks, including what would it mean for literature to get fucked? And what do we mean by literature with a capital L here? Is the literature that gets fucked the idea of literature as an exercise in imaginative meaning making? Is it the kind of sociality of the literary field that we see here that includes not only these other writers, many of whom he is telling to get fucked, right, throughout the list? Does it also include literary critics who he indicates his hatred for elsewhere on the list? Or is it something about the kind of disjunction that we think exists between what we call literature and what we call life? Because I think for Murnane, that's the disjunction, or that's the nexus that he's working so intensely at unraveling and at putting back together. And so does telling literature to get fucked mean that you actually articulate a new understanding of what literature is and what it can do, vis-a-vis its opposite, which might be something like life? So that was my first one. So now you give us your second.
I should say that was just an enormously tempting one for me too. Again, it's just a kind of eminently quotable sentiment. It's right. Deeply funny, and I think some of the kind of abrasiveness of Murnane's humor is a really important part of this list as well. I'd be tempted to say it's very Australian. I'm not sure that's actually entirely true, but there is something about the kind of playful anti-intellectualism of that I think really speaks to his cultural moment in a way.
Well, but also there's a kind of wonderful self-parody too. So one of the ones very near should I tell literature to get fucked is my precious glass marbles, which I read somewhat parodically, the utterance of a writer who knows that he comes back to the same object, the objects that wink at him, with a kind of totemic reverence. And you can almost imagine this being written down, sort of J.R.R. Tolkien Schmiegel, like, my precious glass marbles.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And then, of course, there's that cliche about losing one's marbles, and I'm sure he's playing around with that as well.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, my next choice actually comes directly after should I tell literature to get fucked. My next choice is Peter Carey exposed at last. I'm fascinated by that, actually for somewhat similar reasons to the aforementioned sentence. I guess I'm fascinated by it because we can't know precisely what he's going to do to expose Peter Carey. It's actually just a kind of charge, it's an act of position taking in that sense. And it seems to me a charge that's quite consistent, or at least sort of occupies a similar set of generic terms to some of the other charges in this list. So when he says something like Judith Wright, hypocrite and liar, or when he accuses Thomas Keneally of being a plagiarist, I think that he's occupying a similar position to the position that he occupies in this sentence. And that I would say is the sort of position of the truth teller. In exposing people as liars, in showing up plagiarists, what you're doing is you're kind of bringing the truth to light. And so I guess it doesn't really matter what he actually charges Peter Carey with, or what, what he sort of does to expose him at the end of the day. It's more about this kind of dialectic. This other writer is a kind of liar. I, Gerald Murnane, am a sort of truth-telling figure. And that's another way in which I'd want to sort of align some of this list, with his broader work. It seems to me to push toward that same kind of aspiration of radical candor. And to be clear, although there's a kind of pettiness to it here, I think it's also the thing that drives his work and makes it extraordinary and remarkable. That kind of absolute commitment to truth is the thing that makes his writing totally fascinating. If one is interested in what, sorry, you go.
No, keep going, and then I'll say what you sparked another thought in my mind. So keep going.
We must come back to what you're about to say, but I'll just say really, really quickly that if one wants to take bets on what he's going to charge Peter Carey with, I think we find a clue in his essay, Save Us from Text Maniacs. He mentions this little exercise that he did with like a group of aspiring publishers, I think, where he gave them passages from a recent prize-winning Australian novel, and he sort of got them to assess these passages on grammatical grounds. And apparently, they all loathed a certain writer, and I think that writer is Peter Carey. I think that was the exposition. That's my wild theory on how he's going to expose him. But sorry, Let's come back to your point, Merve.
No, just you starting with Oakley and then going to Carey and using the list to kind of create a narrative of sociality whereby Murnane stands both at the center and outside as that truth teller. It just made me think of other kind of narrative arcs that you could draw through the list. And in fact, the way that the list is setting up certain kinds of narrative arcs. For instance, looking at this page, I take a great risk. I risked but one. And then I rebuff a wealthy widow, the rich widow's revenge. And then the question seems to be, am I an ignoramus part of that narrative arc, or does that start something separate, or is it completely distinctive from what comes before or what comes after? And that just made me think about how, particularly in his later period, so many of the novels, or so many of the books, I should say, do seem to be separate from, but also continuations of one another. And the way that they can sort of stand on their own, they can be autonomous objects, but they also exist within this larger system that maps out his thought. And in that way, it seems to me that the list is offering a kind of microcosm of the way that the universe of his work, of his writing operates.
Precisely right. I mean, I think you're absolutely correct to identify a kind of local grafting in the list that's more broadly symptomatic of a kind of conceptual thematic grafting that's going on throughout the work. I mean, even in the case of something like border districts, which he then in Last Letter to a Reader sort of explicitly says, I thought about it while I was writing it as kind of writing back to or rewriting the plains. It seems like that kind of grafting, that kind of recursive impulse is a really important part of his late work. I have to give you one more example from the list. I was just going to say really quickly.
That's what Last Letter to a Reader is all about, of course, right? Taking kind of small things from the earlier work and then stretching them out into their own little essays or little fictions, whatever you want to call that, right? I think it brings that logic, or it foregrounds that logic in such a way that it prompts you to kind of go back and read all of the novels as part of one large system.
Yeah, well, that's precisely right. I mean, I used that word auto-exegetical before, and I think that there is something of the kind of exegesis or of the sort of reflection on one's own creative work to that collection of kind of essays. And I think that's an interesting reflection of some of Murnane's institutional context as well. We can come back to that later on. But one other kind of small list is just, I love this one. I'm a vengeful bastard. I'm a prophet. I take a funny turn. It's just terrific. It's hilarious. And I deeply love it. So can we come to your second choice, Merve?
Yes, my second choice is, if I were a coward, I would burn this file. And I think that this builds off of what you were saying about Murnane as a truth teller, but I think it also raises the specter of shame and the role that shame, and particularly childhood shame, sexual shame, plays in many of the novels. So the idea that what is in the file could potentially be so self-exposing, could potentially render the writer of it so vulnerable that it would take an act of bravery simply to put it in the archive as opposed to burning it, is what's indicated to me by the title. But then, of course, what's interesting too is that the self-exposure that takes place in the prose, the self-exposure that takes place in the writing is never as straightforward as what we think of as, mere confessional writing. What I love about Murnane, and one of the reasons that I've been rereading Proust alongside him as I've been writing about him, is because I think he has a very kind of intuitive grasp of both the vulnerability and the protectiveness that's offered by splitting the self into author, narrator, and personage. And that, I think, for him comes to take the place of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. It is the Trinity that saturates his work. And I think, like the Holy Trinity, those three figures, author, narrator, and personage, are both one and not one. And they can hide behind one another, but they can also expose one another to the judgments or aspersions of readers. And so I think that if I were a coward, I would burn this file, even in the kind of foregrounding of the personal pronoun I. Well, who is the I in Murnane's writing? Gets at all of those dynamics of self-splitting, of exposure, of vulnerability, and activates, at least in me, something I've told you about, that readerly desire to protect the Trinity.
Yes, I think that's, again, kind of profoundly true. I mean, the only thing perhaps to sort of add to that, is of course that it's not merely that, he has a file kind of labeled that, it's signposted that,
Right.
And it's also reproduced as part of the list of signposts that he's chosen. So, on the one hand, if I were a coward, I would burn this file. But on the other hand, he's actively drawing his sort of future archive diver, his future ideal reader. He's actively drawing their attention to that file. And that's a fascinating sort of gesture of self-protection and self-exposure simultaneously.
Right.
I think
Right.
that's a really
that's a great
move.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, what's your second? And then I'm warning you, I'm going to cheat on my third. So.
Sure. Well, my second was the Peter Carey one, but my third is actually quite sort of closely related, to this question of, a more literal sense of self-exposure. It's one that we were actually talking about just before we had this conversation, but it's the top of the second page. It's the untranslated Hungarian. But of course, if you translate it, it translates to my dick measurements, etc. And this is a kind of fascinating instance of self-exposure, in part because, of its kind of sheer puerility, and because of its kind of, because of the kind of the risk of overexposure that it epitomizes. But also it's a kind of gesture of concealment. You sort of, you hide it in Hungarian, and you kind of distance the reader's capacity to access that information, unless they either use Google Translate as I did, or they have kind of language knowledge in order to get out that. And in that sense, it looks like a kind of reduction to absurdity of some of the aspirations of his fiction, which don't quite teeter into that realm of self-exposure. I mean, I'd say the closest thing is something like the section of Landscape with Landscape titled Charlie Alcock's Cock, which adopts a kind of similar line and is deeply interested, in characters exposing their genitals to each other.
Well, I mean, what does one? I find I actually get stuck on the etc., the STB. That, for whatever reason, is what I can't get over in the item, because in like, what does one learn about a person from their dick measurements, really? I mean, what kind of knowledge could possibly be gained there? All you really get is a number. And so once you realize that, what becomes curious, or what inspires what motivates the desire to learn more is that etc., because that etc. could indicate anything. So in some way, I think the dick measurements are the bait that lures you into that. But then, you could open that folder, and it could be, a page of basically the same number for 40 years, and then a brilliant manuscript behind it, which is indicated only by that STB. So I'm going to cheat on my third one. Can you scroll down to the next archive?
Yeah, just one thing to say really quickly about that as well. It's just the term measurements as well. It's such a fastidious term, and it's kind of so characteristic of his prose in that way. It's like, to really get the full truth of Gerald Murnane, we need to know this kind of ridiculous prurient detail as well. And then, of course, there's a possibility that it's a hoax. Hoaxes, how I love them,
well,
is another item.
Hoaxes, I love them, he tells us.
Who knows what that file contains? I mean, it could be anything. But sorry, so are you on the second page for this one, or are you on the first?
No, so
if
you go to the third page, so the second archive, which I think we should just show people as well, because mine, I'm gonna pull from there. Yeah, so, and then, yes, so the next page of this chronological archive.
Gotcha.
Yep, keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Sorry, it's the next image.
No worries.
It's the one, oh, here we go. Okay, yes. A detailed account. Oh no, go back.
Sorry. As in, do you want me to go back to the previous page?
Yeah, it's at the top of, it's the detailed account of the sexual game.
Okay. Oh yeah, here it is. Yeah, a detailed account of a mental game devised.
Of a mental game, sorry. Yes, could you, I can't quite see it on your screen, so.
I can zoom in a little bit. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, a detailed account of a mental game devised by Gerald Murnane in the early 1990s in order to indulge his various sexual fantasies, detailed written reports comprising more than 170,000 words of numerous playings of the mental game. So before the audience joined us, Joseph, Monique, and I were having a conversation about Murnane's gender politics. And I was saying that at the risk of being scolded, I feel like I could be accused of being a kind of minimizer of his gender politics, in part because I find that he is so insistent on the fictiveness of the universe that he has created, that any kind of sexual game, any expression of desire, of longing, that is narrated to us from within the world of his prose seems to me to exist in a kind of a domain that has only a tangential relationship to the properly political world that we inhabit, where our gender politics are things that are lived out in everyday embodied kinds of ways. And to me, and I realize that is probably a controversial claim, and that people could push back against it. But to me, the reason that this is my third one is because I think there's something in the description of the mental game and in the sheer proportion of words dedicated to chronicling this mental game that puts pressure on the claim that I've just made, right? What does it mean to play this mental game, to indulge sexual fantasies, and to write more than 170,000 words about it? So it becomes a kind of litmus test, I think, for understanding or trying to explain how it is that one thinks about the relationships between, as he puts it, males and females across much of the writing, let's say. And I think it links back to what we were talking about before, Joseph, that peculiar dialectic between self-exposure and self-protection, between prurience and vulnerability.
Yeah. Again, I think that's totally spot on. And also measurement. Measurement comes up again, like 170,000
Yes.
words. You know, he wants to tell us exactly how many words he's devoted to everything. I mean, there's that other moment, I think at the start of his essay in Invisible Yet Enduring Lilacs, I think the essay is titled something like the TypeScript ends here. And he reflects like briefly on just how many words of student essays, or no, student short stories rather, he read during his time at what is now Deakin University. And I think he estimates, and again, I'm going off memory, so please correct me if I'm wildly wrong, but I think it's something
you're right.
I think it's something like 300 or 400 essays per year. Sorry, essays, stories. Again, I'm doing the Murnane thing, calling sort of essays, stories, essays, rather. So 300 or 400 per year, 16 years, 2,000 words an essay. You know, if one does the math, we're looking at something like 10 million words of stories, of student sort of material that he's read over the course of his career. And I think that actually sort of trying to kind of to quantify the things that Murnane spends his time doing, or that, you know, that influence him, can be a really interesting activity in terms of kind of shedding light on his writing. I mean, you know, particularly if one takes at face value the sort of description of his assessment process that he makes in that story, The Boy's Name Was David. I mean, if he's doing that for each of those, you know, for each of those, a total of 10 million words of stories, then that act, that kind of that editorial act, I think, tells us something about his own process of composition.
Well, it also tells us something about the way that he thinks about scale and about scaling up from these very small units, from, you know, not just sentences really, but clauses. I mean, I think the clause is really the important unit in Murnane's prose. Scaling up from clauses, scaling up from complete grammatical units to paragraphs, to essays or pieces in which the paragraphs are often in a kind of amazing dialogue with one another. And what it reminds me of more than anything else is something like the Suzuki method, where the way that one learns how to play an instrument is to begin with these very, very small sections of notation, and then master those sections of notation, and then use them to build up into increasingly complicated pieces. And one of my favorite novelists, not Australian, I apologize, Helen DeWitt, in her book, The Last Samurai, has a wonderful meditation on what it means to teach language the way that Suzuki teaches music. And I think that one of the things you get is not just a kind of extraordinary and almost enchanted technicity when it comes to the construction of sentences and when it comes to the play of grammar, but also something that Murnane says is extremely important to him in one of the essays in Invisible but Enduring Lilacs, which is rhythm. You have a sense for how, what the rhythm of a sentence is, what the rhythm of a paragraph is, and what the rhythm of an entire piece or an entire composition is. And so I think that one of the things you see in this list, ranging from the item that I've just given to the Dick measurements, is the preoccupation with scale and its relationship to rhythm.
Yeah, so again, I think that's absolutely spot on. I wonder if we can think about, you know, the kind of feelings that Murnane's sentences might kind of elicit from us, in part virtue of their rhythm, and in part, I think, virtue of this question of scale. I mean, one of the things that you wrote to me in advance of this session, you know, was that you find Murnane both exhausting and exhilarating. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that pairing, because I think that really does hit the nail on the head. We've probably done enough torture at this stage that we can sort of leave exhausting off to the side for the moment. But I want to think about exhilarating. So Murnane uses the word exhilarating, or, you know, a sort of a different conjugation of it, in the form of exhilaration. He uses that exactly once in his collected short stories, and he uses it in the story The Boy's Name Was David, which we mentioned beforehand. And he uses it there to describe the narrating personage's response to that titular sentence, i.e. The boy's name was David. That, for Murnane's narrator, is an exhilarating sentence. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, whether you find that an exhilarating sentence. And second, if not, you know, where else might you locate exhilaration in Murnane's writing?
Well, I think you cannot understand why that sentence is exhilarating without comparing it to the first sentence in The Boy's Name Was David, because the title is The Boy's Name Was David, but then the first sentence is the man's name was whatever it was. So I think that there are two things that we could say here. I mean, the first goes back to what I was saying earlier about the fascination with proper names in Murnane. And, you know, when we think about how people have theorized proper names, we usually think about two things. I mean, first, that a proper name is intended to pick out a specific object. But second, that a proper name can belong to many different kinds of objects. And so the stability of the proper name never emerges from a kind of one-to-one relationship between the name and what is being named, but rather from a whole field of language. And I'm just riffing on Derrida here, right? This is just straight up, you know, the deconstructionist argument about the function of proper names and how that essential ambiguity or indeterminacy of the proper name gets at something about the ambiguity or indeterminacy of naming in general. And so I think that Murnane is totally aware of that, which is why oftentimes when there is a proper name introduced in his prose, it's always qualified by a kind of self-reflexive, recursive move, like if we could call him that, or the character, whatever their name is, as they were called. So there's always attention being drawn to the fact that naming is an essentially indeterminate, fictional practice that we engage in, right? So that's maybe one thing that I would say. The second thing that, and I think that's where it gains some of its exhilaration from, right? That to believe in the name as calling out a particular person is an extraordinary leap of faith that we have to make. And it's a leap of faith that fiction asks us to make all the time. So that's one thing. The second thing I might say is that, you know, when you and I talked about naming before, you said sort of parenthetically that for you, The Boy's Name Was David is not as exhilarating a sentence as call me Ishmael or my name is Ruth. And I was thinking a little bit about how what all three of those names share is that they do, to follow up on this topic of faith, that they do all have these very, very strong biblical resonances, as does David, right? David as the shepherd, David as the slayer of Goliath, David as the penitent. And just to pull together some of the threads of what we've been talking about Murnane, right? Should I tell literature to get fucked? The radical truth telling of the lone outsider who comes up against the vast apparatus that is literature, telling it to get fucked, is a kind of David and Goliath story. And so I think that part of the exhilaration of that comes from the whole chain of significations that the name David points us toward, the same way that Ishmael points us toward the wanderer, or that Ruth points us toward the faithful caretaker of a kind of matriarchal line, right? So those are just the two things that I would say. And maybe the third thing just to add, and then I promise I will stop talking about this. The third thing just to add is to start that story with the line, the man was called whatever he was called, or sorry, the man's name was whatever it was, is essentially to say, like, first to make visible that naming is a kind of game and a game that's played within fiction. But second, to assert oneself, the author / narrator, as being above that game, as being the maker, a rule breaker, but also a maker of a new set of rules about what it is possible to name and not to name in fiction or in an essay or in any work of literature. And I think that's another way of telling literature to get fucked, is I know the name game you play and I'm not participating in it. Or when I do participate in it, it will be in such a way that you recognize the full force behind what I am doing and why it is a kind of act of faith, why it is a moment of transcendence.
Mm. So my question for you then is Murnane's first sentence in that story more exhilarating than the title?
I don't think you can separate them from one another. They each gain their charge from the other. I mean, I think the difference between both of those and something like Call Me Ishmael is that, that Melville's doing it in a slightly different way, right? Call Me Ishmael is an imperative. And it doesn't suggest that the character's name or the projected personhood is actually named Ishmael, but then it kind of reveals what the whole fiction behind naming in the first place. And I think the imperative, call me, gets at that in a slightly different way than the tension between the boy's name was David and the man's name was whatever he was called gets at it.
Yes. Again, I think that's totally spot on. I guess what I'm kind of hinting at here is a slight departure between sort of Murnane's conception of how his kind of narrating personage is reading that sentence and how we're both reading it. I actually agree with you. I'm quite entranced by the relationship between that first sentence and the title. And indeed, I'm really interested in this short story as a whole, but I'm not quite sure that I share Murnane's faith that the sentence is the sort of unit that gives most meaning in proportion to its extent. I'm much more in your camp in that I agree that it's the kind of interrelation between sentences that really works for Murnane. I mean, we were talking about Helen Garner before. Sorry, you go, Merve.
Yeah. Oh, no, I was just going to say, I really do think my favorite piece of his writing is A History of Books. And I think part of the reason is because the logic of how sentences work with one another is so beautifully foregrounded in the first paragraph, which I've sort of marked up here. And as I was rereading it this morning and thinking about the technicity of grammar and how the technicity of grammar might rise to the level of something transcendent or enchanted, I was thinking, and as I was thinking about rhythm too, I was thinking about how what he does so beautifully is kind of alternate these densely hypotactic sentences where you have these kind of various nested clauses that are redefining characters or terms that have been introduced earlier on in the sentence with these very kind of straightforward, simple paratactical sentences. And that to me is the kind of rhythm of a Murnane paragraph, is alternating between the kind of densely hypotactical and the paratactical to create a kind of long, short, long, short, long, short rhythm, or at least that's how I hear his paragraphs and his sentences.
Yes, again, I think that's entirely true, and actually that prose rhythm is sort of enormously important to Murnane's writing.
Yeah,
I'm mindful, I'm sort of keeping an eye on time, and I'm mindful we're supposed to go
for
about 50 minutes. I will just ask one more question and then we'll turn it over to sort of questions from the audience. I should just say, audience members, you can use this question time, if you like, to compose a question in the chat, or if you want to sort of raise your hand using the Zoom function. I believe we will be able to sort of beam you in, and you'll be able to ask questions through that. But if we can just conclude by coming back to that note of protectiveness that we both share, that sense that there's something about Murnane's writing that elicits a degree of protectiveness on the part of his readers. Could you just talk to us a little bit about that, Merve?
I was talking to a friend of mine who is also a huge admirer. And he was saying that his friends who teach in US MFA programs, and maybe actually this relates to your dissertation work nicely, Joseph, his friends who teach in US MFA programs have a kind of allergy or antipathy to Murnane because they felt like he was big in the US MFA program scene for a while, and that what they would see were these kind of imitations of his prose. And this friend of mine who was narrating the story then told me about how their friend started imitating Murnane, and it was brutal to listen to, not because it was bad, but because it was so good. And I don't know if you've ever tried this. I tried it for a little bit when I was working on this piece, just to kind of understand a little bit of what I was saying about the kind of grammatical arrangement of the sentences, but also just technically how it is that you split yourself into author, narrator, and personage. And so I wrote about myself from the perspective of one of the figures we often encounter in Murnane's prose, which is the dark-haired woman with the faintly olive skin, right? And I realized as I was doing that how extraordinarily exposed one feels when one splits the self like that. And I think that's where my sense of protectiveness comes from. That to externalize yourself, to transform yourself into an object of your own writing, can leave you feeling profoundly raw. And I think that when I read him, I feel that rawness, but also that rawness being given to us through material or through techniques that are at once incredibly crude and incredibly fine. And I think this is where the ease of the parody and the cruelty of the impulse to parody comes from, that you could do what he does. It would be, not all that difficult to reproduce it. But in reproducing it, you would lose something of the kind of earnest commitment that I think guides him to it, and that infuses the material with that kind of the fineness of sensibility. I'm not sure what exactly to call it. You would lose some of that, you would damage some of that, you would kind of desecrate some of that. And so I think that in the face of that impulse to parody, to desecrate, to leave all of that rawness exposed, my sense of a kind of ferocious protectiveness gets activated. And I just can't think of many other writers whom I feel that way toward. I mean, I think Jan Fosse is another writer who activates that in me, at least. I don't know about you, if you have other writers who you feel that sort of protectiveness toward. But yeah, Murnane and Jan Fosse, I would say, are the two that spring immediately to mind. And I don't think it's an accident that one is coming from but has disavowed a religious background and the other has converted to Catholicism. I think religion probably plays into that in some way for me.
I think I feel a little bit of that protectiveness toward Helen Garner, honestly. I mean, that's in part that some of that emerges through sort of knowledge of her, critical history. But I think also there's something about that vulnerability that self-exposure invites that runs across both their work that does actually elicit that kind of protectiveness. And I really liked your point about sort of the way that imitational mimicry would strip some of that away. I mean, part of the pleasure of reading a sentence like "the boy's name was David" is that in a Murnane story that the sentence that follows is not going to be, now he's no longer named David, he is now named Jim, because that would be a kind of deception that Murnane would find deeply uncomfortable sort of practicing on us. There's no real room for that unreliability in Murnane's fiction. Which is perhaps why he wants to expose Peter Carey, because Peter Carey is all about that. Peter Carey is all about sort of rollicking, unreliable narrators. Serialized in case of Billy Wacker.
So then, okay, this is the last thing I'll say, and then we can turn to the Q&A. But then what do you make of the item on the list that's, I rebuff Helen Garner forcefully?
It's a great question. I do remember reading somewhere about the circumstances of that rebuff. I believe that Murnane had gone out of state for possibly the first time, or at least, sort of very infrequent travel out of state for a prize, that's right. That I think Helen Garner ended up winning, possibly for her short story collection, the title of which escapes me, Postcards from Surfers. She may have won it for that.
I don't have it somewhere under this pile,
somewhere in there. But I suspect that rebuff was a kind of possibly a moment of emotional vulnerability on Murnane's part. So interesting that signpost positions him as a kind of antagonist. His terms of representation there are, I rebuff Helen Garner. You can sort of read it alongside the other signposts where he's falling out with people. But the truer story may in fact be that it was a moment of emotional vulnerability on Murnane's part. And Garner appears not to have held a grudge on that front. So again, a kind of really fascinating case for thinking about the truth value of those signposts and whether they actually present him on more self-deprecating terms than reading them in isolation might allow us to appreciate. Excellent. If there's nothing further, we might turn it over to questions. I see that we've got a couple in the chat already. Excellent. Would you like to feed those through to us?
Oh, sure. So the first one is from Teja, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's about your reference to your riff on Derrida, Merve. Murnane always qualifies, and the way Murnane always qualifies a proper name. I found that his prose almost must be influenced by deconstructive thought and the slippage of meaning. Do you think that stems solely from the separation of writer, narrator, and personage, or do you think Murnane genuinely tried to avoid creating solidly defined structures and names?
I mean, I think that probably less than him being influenced by deconstructionist thought is the way that deconstructionist thought, particularly in the writing of Derrida, but more in the writing of Desman, takes Proust and Proust's novels as a major point of departure. So my guess is, Tejas, that it's Proust that connects, is the kind of point of triangulation between Murnane and the deconstructionists. And I think that, yes, that does stem from the separation of writer, narrator, and personage. I don't think that there is a kind of more gimmicky avoidance of solidly defined character or name. I mean, I actually think your question relates interestingly to Henry's question, which is that in Barley Patch, the narrator argues that the production of novels, indeed the written word in general, is an imperfect representation of the contents of their mind. And so in that sense, if you have a character in your mind, an image character, right, as Murnane says, we didn't talk about that usage, Joseph, but we probably should have. If you have an image woman or an image man in your mind, then the attempt to fix them in words is always going to fall short, right, is always going to fall short of any kind of pure mimesis of the contents of one's mind. That isn't possible.
Mm-hmm. One tiny little thought sort of about Murnane and Derrida and deconstruction. I believe that it's Emre Salazinski who's written a kind of Derridean reading of Murnane. And I just think that it's interesting how often Murnane mentions correspondence with him in those signposts. I mean, once that archive eventually becomes available, you know, if you wanted to sort of trace that lineage, you could certainly do so via Proust. But maybe there's something in those conversations as well, you know, in which a sort of resistance to that reading nonetheless filters into the later fiction.
Yeah, I just can't imagine him. I mean, other people might have different thoughts. I just can't imagine him tolerating reading long stretches of Derrida or Desman. Although I really love, I mean, some of my favorite, I can't remember if it's in A History of Books. Now I can't, they're starting to bleed together a little bit. I can't remember which one it is where he talks at length about Wayne Booth. And he talks at length about his reading of the German narratologist whose name is escaping me now. And actually some of my favorite parts of Murnane's writing are the moments when he's writing about criticism and the way that he's paraphrasing criticism, paraphrasing criticism in such a way that it almost makes criticism into a form of fiction. Mm-hmm. And I love that.
Yes.
There are about 3 questions in chat, as well as one more in Q&A. Sorry to interrupt there.
It's okay.
Yeah,
just going to say really, really quickly that I'm pretty sure he talks about Booth in A Million Windows off the top of my head.
Yes, in A Million.
He definitely gets a mention there. Just in case people are sort of trying to follow these things up at home. Hopefully we'll be publishing a version of this, a transcript of this chat in the Sydney Review of Books. And what we'll try and do is we'll try and sort of, you know, footnote things and make links clearer, really, so that if you're kind of trying to follow along certain things at home, you'll be able to do so in that format. But shall we move on to some other questions?
Can you guys see the chat?
Yes, we can. Joseph, do you want to take Arca's question about time?
Sure, yeah. Let me just read this aloud. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how time functions in his narrative. As a reader of his prose, I've often felt that he's one of those rare writers whose recursiveness constantly reminds us of the very time of composition. What is happening around us as we write? When the Murnane narrator takes us back to the previous paragraph, the reader just read, and the personage in that paragraph, it's a curious convergence of the compositional time at the time of reading. Yes. There is a strange looping of the present and the past there, insofar as the time of the previous paragraph is now time past as we read on.
Oh, that's really beautiful.
Longer question. Yeah, that's a really fantastic set of thoughts. Did you want to kick us off there, Merve?
Well, I mean, the way that you put that, Arka, which is very, very beautiful, reminds me of a passage in Proust that Murnane keeps going back to, which is in Time Regained, the moment when Marcel is standing on the paving stones, the two uneven paving stones, and all of a sudden he remembers standing on those two uneven paving stones before, when he was in Venice. And that opens onto a wonderful meditation on the Madeleine, on the sound of the train, on the color of a tablecloth or the sound of a tablecloth. And all of those moments where the past and the present seem to exist not in some kind of linear relationship to one another, but instead seem to become perfectly coextensive with one another. And that's what I think the kind of looping of the paragraphs is trying to accomplish, that kind of saturation of the past into, or the bleeding of the past into the present, in a way that I think maybe can only be accomplished by literature, precisely because of the capacity it has to loop, the capacity that it has to kind of infiltrate space and time, or to interpenetrate space and time. So that was my first thought, Joseph, if you want to build off of that.
I don't have much further to say. I mean, all I would say is that if I wanted to think further about those questions, I would go and have another look at landscape with landscape, because of course that microcosmic concern at the level of paragraph gets fascinatingly sort of scaled up to the level of narrative in the form of that book's kind of Ouroboros-like structure, whereby the implied author of a given section, is the sort of is a what's the phrase I'm looking for, is a character in the previous section. That's how that text functions. And Murnane writes about that quite explicitly in the last letter to a reader. And then of course the final section prefigures the first as well.
Yeah, and I was trying to remember where it was, and I'll just maybe read a tiny bit from A Million Windows, Arka, that I think also gets at this. The lives of the two fictional personages had then seemed to go forward, not as the lives of actual persons go forward, but as the lives of characters in works of fiction are enabled to go forward, which is to say that the deeds and words and thoughts of the personages seem not to occur in what is commonly called time, and time is italicized there, but in what was called earlier in this work, the narrative dimension. And I kind of think of that narrative dimension as something similar to what Bakhtin called the chronotope, right? In that dimension, events, so to call them, that might have occupied a year of actual time, so to call it, are reported in a single paragraph, whereas the contents of a few moments might need for their full appraisal a chapter that might detain the reader for an hour and might have occupied the writer for a week. So in addition to the kind of looping that you're talking about, Arka, there's also a real emphasis on the capacity of literature to both compress and to stretch or expand time, as well as to bring the past into the present with full force.
Yeah, if I could just say something really quickly about those little reservations that are so carefully built into Murnane's fiction.
I
was reading, they're really interesting. I was reading this is it Catherine Gallagher? I was reading her essay, The Rise of Fictionality, just the other day, and she makes this extraordinary point about how those reservations, she's not thinking about Murnane here, she's thinking about particularly sort of 18th century novels, but she makes the point that those reservations are a kind of early novel technology, that you kind of need them if your reader doesn't yet know how to read fiction. You need somebody to sort of couch and explain things if they're not familiar with the sort of presuppositions of a given genre, i.e. the content of this work is fictional. And I think that there is really something ground zero about Murnane's writing, and that's part of what makes it so exciting. It's like you're being retrained in how to read the novel. Now, of course, one could argue that actually what he's writing is kind of not really all that novelistic, that actually sort of true fiction is a category in itself. But I do like the idea that I'm being retrained while I reread his fiction.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, and what you're saying actually, I think goes back to the word that you keep evoking, which is truth, right? Because for Gallagher, what's so important in that article is the distinction between fiction and lies, and the potential that there at one point was not a meaningful distinction between fiction and lies. So to bring back truth as an important category and to knit it to fiction in a very explicit sort of way is, I think, also part of those qualifications, or part of the project of those qualifications, which I also really love. I see Simon has a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Monique. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, there was, just before Simon, there was a question from Anonymous there. Do you think Murnane is more honest in his signposts or his fiction? And then Simon next. More honest in his signposts or his fiction?
What is honesty? There are different kinds of honesty. Okay? They're different. I don't know if anyone's ever really honest, but insofar as people are capable of being honest, I think they're aspiring to different kinds of honesty. They're to different kinds of readers. I don't know, Joseph, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, part of my research interest is basically in sort of trying to get writers to be honest about the degree to which they've depended over their careers on institutions. So I'm inclined to say the signposts are kind of more honest because they give me a picture of the social Murnane, the Murnane who has in fact interacted with other people, who isn't just this kind of hyper-provincial figure. But as Merve says, honesty is a really complicated business. Are you more honest when you meticulously construct an articulation? Are you more honest when you very carefully put sentences together in order to arrive at a kind of statement of truth? Or are you more honest in shorthand, in sort of casual forms, where you kind of flitter across vendettas and vengeances and perversions and everything in between? Any further thoughts on that front, Merve?
No, I think that's perfect. I think that's perfect.
Simon's question about the ideal reader.
He isn't writing for you or me, but who is that ideal reader? Sorry, I'll read it. Murnane often mentions that he isn't writing for you or me, but for his ideal reader. Who is that ideal reader? Is this a kind of insult to his actual flesh and blood readers? Joseph,
I'm not particularly insulted. I'm not offended. I mean, I'm fascinated sort of more broadly by fantasies of ideal readers. I mean, one version of the sort of ideal reader that Merve, of course, knows a lot about is Nabokov's figure of the good reader. Merve's book Paraliterary starts off with this little quiz that Nabokov gave his students, where he sort of has these four characteristics of the good reader, and he sort of bashes students for getting these things wrong. As for Murnane's ideal reader, let me just reread that question again. If you want to jump in while I'm doing so,
I can jump in. I mean, I kind of link Simon's excellent question to what you were saying before, Joseph, about how Murnane trains you to read him, and in fact, I do think that training. And maybe I'm only speaking for myself, Simon and Joseph, but I do think that training differentiates you from the flesh and blood reader that you were prior to coming to his work, from the reader that you become reading it. I do think that the prose has the capacity to turn you into a specter of that. I mean, the ideal reader is always already a kind of ghostly presence, right? But I do think that the prose has the ability to turn you into the ideal reader, to have you inhabit a landscape that is not equivalent to, but coextensive with the landscape that he has first in his mind and then commits to the page. So, even if you can't match whatever that vision, the image reader might be in his mind, I do think that a certain kind of attentive reading practice gets you somewhere closer to what that ideal reader might be than to the flesh and blood creature you were before you encountered his works. But now I realize I'm sounding a little bit like someone who's joined a cult. So, I'm maybe that is just my own fantasy reacting to his fantasy.
Yeah. Well, it's worth remembering as well that he would probably accuse us of all being in a cult, which is the cult of the text maniacs. You have to remember that his ideal reader is also kind of not an academic reader. It's a careful reader. It's a reader that follows meticulously these kind of extraordinary connections that he draws through his fiction. But it's not necessarily a reader that arrives with a ton of presuppositions or indeed a kind of formal training. If I were really kind of on my dissertation horse, I'd wonder if there isn't something about the discipline of creative writing that is sort of distilled in his figure of the ideal reader, which is also a kind of intuitive, natural born genius that is willing to sort of follow the grain of the work without a ton of kind of tertiary training. That's, again,
right. So
sort of
that's
speculation territory.
That also doesn't exist, right? Or I'm convinced that doesn't really exist. And maybe this also gets back to the point that we were making about self-protectiveness and self-exposure, which is that if you posit an ideal reader, then you buffer yourself from the disappointments of all your unideal or imperfect readers who don't get you the way you want to be gotten. So that might just be another dimension to add to this and another way to link it back to the conversation we were having.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I was hinting at before by sort of doing the math on how many student essays Murnane has read. I mean, he's the sort of ideal reader that he is, in part because of 16 years at a college of advanced education, later a university. That editorial work functionally paid enormous dividends in his writing, I think.
Well, I mean, and it's a difference too, right? I'm interested to know if your dissertation talks about this, Joseph, but the difference between teaching composition and teaching creative writing seems to be an important one here, and maybe gets back to the questions that we've been raising about grammar, about the sentence as a unit, about rhythm, about scale, right? All of those things might seem to come more to the fore, I think, in the composition classroom than they do in the creative writing classroom.
Yeah, and of course, Murnane's, again, if his account in The Boy's Name Was David is to be believed, his assessment practice is not a kind of creative writing assessment practice. It's a composition assessment practice. It's deducting marks every time he has to pause on a sentence. So there's something kind of deeply ret comp about it, even as Australia doesn't have sort of rhetoric and composition departments in the way that the US does. So that's a really kind of curious institutional kind of, anomaly in its own right, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great.
There are two more questions in Q&A, one from Moshe Priga. In a private letter from him to me, Gerald Murnane wrote that from all his books, A Million Windows was his most important one. He didn't explain the reason. What is Merve's take on this book?
Oh, I mean, yeah, I think it is probably, after the opening essay in A History of Books, my favorite of his as well. Give me a second to come up with a reason why, though. Intuitively, I agree, but let me just flip back through to figure out why that's the case. It certainly has the most dog ears out of all of the. Joseph, do you have an answer while I compose one myself?
I mean, I should confess that it's probably among my least favorite of his books.
Oh, really?
I mean, yeah, for me, I it's a kind of cliche choice, but I really do love the plains. Now, my issue, and I'm going to fully confess to this because I think that it's sort of in the spirit of Murnane to confess to this. My issue, of course, is that I'm reading his fiction, in part, obviously primarily for pleasure, but in part to write a dissertation about them. So I'm inclined to sort of prefer and to reread those fictions that speak most directly to the kind of arguments that I want to make. And the truth is that the plains fits my purposes beautifully. I mean, we were sort of talking beforehand about, some of the kind of oddities of Australian literature, and one oddity is that we don't really have kind of campus novels. I mean, there's maybe one example, which is Michael Wilding's Academia Nuts, which is a very good title, but I don't love it as a novel, I should say. But I would say that The Plains is a kind of campus novel. That's at least what my chapter argues.
This is why Murnane doesn't write for academics.
That's right.
Yeah. I would have not. I think the reason it's my favorite Murnane is probably because it has the most vivid central image in my mind out of any of his books, which is the drop of golden oil on the dull window pane, right? That is the image that knits together every single section of that book. And I think that it's fascinating to me because even though it moves, right? Even though it moves, even though it is, it moves through Bronte, through Hardy, through stories of Murnane, or through the narrator's boyhood. Even though it moves through that, it keeps coming back to that same image, the drop of golden oil on the dull window pane. And I think that one of the things that, for me at least, reading Murnane does is the same thing that reading Proust does, is you go back and you try to chronicle your Madeleine moments, your paving stone moments, your train sound moments. And so that drop of golden oil on the dull window pane always makes me think of a very lonely afternoon when there was this extremely kind of thick golden light pouring through a bow window. And I don't remember anything else about the afternoon other than the particular quality of that light. And so to me, that's one of a million windows that we could have to look back upon our younger selves, that we see through this kind of prism of time, and I think increasingly through the prism of fiction. And so the logic and the whole structure of A Million Windows, I think, gets at that really, really beautifully. Yeah,
I wondered if you might also love it because you're a Jamesian.
Yeah, I am a Jamesian. Yeah, no, and I obviously love it because of that too. I love it because also, since reading A Million Windows, but actually since reading kind of all of his novels, I have my bedroom window, from my bedroom window, I can see directly into the window of the house across the street from us in Oxford. And there is this older man who sits in front of his window behind this kind of gauzy curtain every night. And he has a stack of books next to him and he's writing something. And I've basically become a peeping Tom because of Gerald Murnane, is what I'm saying. So I spend a good deal of time every night looking through my own kind of bizarrely speckled window into the room of this man who lives across the street, and just wondering what he's writing about and what he's reading. And after doing this for about a week, I told my husband about it, and my husband was like, "What are you talking about? That man is watching television. There's clearly a television in front of him." And I thought, oh, what is it that one can't see? Or how is it that one takes images that seem to be part of reality and transforms them into something else? And isn't that what Murnane is doing in such a beautiful and puzzling sort of way?
Yeah, I suppose the other thing that sorry, Minnie, can I say just one more thing on A Million Windows?
Sorry, I know we're over time. We're way over time. Sorry.
I was just going to say very, very quickly that, if I were sort of inclined to redeem that novel to myself, and I may well be post PhD, I think I would probably do so through the Hal Porter intertext. I mean, I've read The Watcher on a Cast Iron Balcony, and I really love that sort of memoir as well. It's kind of exquisitely written. So I guess if I were to sort of reposition it in my listing, I'd probably do so by thinking carefully about its relation to that text, which is, again, really beautifully written. I recommend it if you haven't come across it before.
So there's two more questions I think that we can fit in before we let you two off the hook. Thanks for this discussion from Anonymous here. I heard from Murnane that he never intended for the contents list of his archive to be made public. My question is, if this is true, is the library clickbait that constitutes this list actually being collectively manufactured in the very action of us talking about it?
I mean, when you say he never intended to make this list public, he did publish it in Music and Literature. So, I don't know if you can get sort of more intentional than that. As to sort of manufacturing conversation around it, yes, shamelessly. To be clear, I am more than happy to sort of indulge in the kind of rumor mongering that he's playing with here, because it's really fun and really interesting. And part of what it means to sort of occupy the literary field is to think about these debates and controversies, and it's the material of literary biography. So again, my answer is sort of shamelessly yes. I hope that isn't too crude an answer.
Should we go straight to the last question, or do you have something there? Okay.
No, I sign off on that wholeheartedly.
Okay. This is from Nick. Narrators in Murnane's fiction often speak about his reading of works of fiction and looking past the characters in his mind to the landscape that reaches far back beyond what is explicitly presented. He often speaks about reading about a hill, for example, and imagining what lives beyond that hill. Do you think this is a predominant quintessential feeling that Murnane tries to evoke in his own works?
Yeah, I think that's, that question plus Simon's question about the ideal reader plus Joseph, your mention of Nabokov earlier made me think about how in that same essay on good readers and good writers, Nabokov imagines the writer and the reader meeting on top of a hill in a kind of beautiful embrace, and how it is in some ways the inverse of the image that he leaves us with at the end of Lolita, which is Humbert on top of the hill, listening to the voices coming from the valley below, where he thinks children playing, where he says, the most poignant absence was not, what was most poignant was not Lolita's absence from my side, but the absence of her voice from that Concord. The Concord. Yeah, from that Concord. And so I do think that goes back to the question of the ideal reader, because the sense I get is that if you are reading him carefully enough, then you do become that ideal reader whose voice is not sort of, maybe explicitly added to the Concord, but who can kind of stand atop the hill at a distance and hear the voices from the valley below. And I do think that promise of a kind of distant or maybe only ever ghostly communion is very much present throughout all of the novel, throughout all of the books. And maybe one test of it is simply something that he says in The Boy's Name Was David, which is that the real kind of test of whether or not a novel has worked on you in the way that it should is if you can recite sentences from it, is if you can recite lines from it, because that becomes a kind of co-inhabitation of the trinity of the author, the narrator, and the personage. And the reader finds a way to kind of sneak herself into that. I don't know what then happens to the trinity. Does it just become an orgy? I'm not sure, but but that's blasphemous. But yes, I mean, I think that image of the reader and the writer meeting atop a hill and listening to the concord of the voices from below is what I feel every time I read Murnane.
Yeah, I mean, I will add one thing and then sign off on that wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Which is just to say that, absolutely one version of that fantasy is the sort of mutually present but isolated writer and reader on the kind of grassy plain. But I think it's important to remember the other version of that fantasy, which is mutually occupying the Trappist monastery, or the kind of writer's workshop or residency. Now, of course, I'm very inclined to say this given my own research interests, but I do think that Murnane's provincial imagination is also a kind of institutional imagination. He's constantly on the lookout for sort of patron institutions that might allow him to quietly go about the business of writing, not quite in the company of others, but in the vicinity of others. And I think that's a really fascinating element of his work.
Can I pop in with one question that kind of leads off all of that, and I guess goes back to the question of time, which Merve answered, I think, in terms of the past and the present in particularly. And I wonder, given this obsession with archiving, and I guess perhaps having a somewhat different take on Murnane than Joseph, at least, I find him a very romantic writer, and perhaps not always so pragmatically looking to kind of be a patron or be patronized. And so I wonder, and to go to the ideal reader as well, could the ideal reader be a future reader in this, in the light of this thought about his interest in the archive and this creation of this world, really, that he's creating in there, that it might be for someone in the future or for posterity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very beautiful idea. I mean, I think it does kind of just come down to the fundamental unknowability of who that reader is, the refusal to specify who that reader is, and the idea, and maybe this is what you find romantic about him, which I also do, the idea that there could be a reader that could take such pleasure in his prose, or who could appreciate his prose to such a totalizing degree that he or she would be able to, through her projection of her own pleasure, would be able to bring what is objectively the essence or the truth of his prose to the light. There's something kind of fundamentally maybe Kantian in the way that I think about how he sets up the writer and reader relationship, and that can happen, as Joseph said, with two people in isolation. It can happen with two people, one in the past, one in the future. That there is no flesh and blood relation required. There is no kind of crude self-exposure required in order for that romantic fantasy of the writer-reader relation to be actualized. And so, yes, I mean, I think the archive obviously exists for the future, but it also exists for the future biographer, doesn't it? Because I think he says, right, that one of the things he feels frustrated by, or that he feels sympathy for, is when people set out to write biographies and there's just like a whole mass of material missing. And then it's like, well, I guess I have to skip, 1943 because we don't know what happened to them. Everything's been burned. And so he has, and I can't tell if it's a joke or not, right? But he says, like, for my future biographer, I don't want you to run into this problem of not having the materials and then having to speculate. So let me give you everything that you need. And of course, that's the exertion of an extraordinary kind of control, right? It's to say, I'm going to give you everything so you cannot embark on the work of speculating about, which is what A Million Windows ends with, right? The idea of speculating about as being the essence of fiction. You cannot embark on a project of speculating about me, because you will have all of the materials at hand.
Yes, everything, including 10,000 anagrams of Gerald Murnane, just in case that's what was missing from your biography.
And my dick measurements, so that every chapter, every year can start with the size of my dick in that year before it goes on to, provide a rich, luminous interpretation of my writing. Yeah.
That's a perfect note to end on, surely.
On that
note. Thank you both for a really wonderful, scintillating conversation. Thank you for your most generous time, Merve and Joseph. It's really been wonderful. So,
thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who asked such wonderful questions. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. They're really excellent set of questions.
Joseph.
And thanks, Monique, and thanks, Merve.